You have been deceived. From the very first day you opened a history textbook or saw a beautiful postcard with gondolas, we have been lied to about Venice our entire lives. This city is not just the romantic capital of the world or a marvel of medieval architecture. It is a crime scene, a place of gigantic, brazen, and cynical engineering falsification, the scale of which makes the hair on your head stand on end. Think about it for a second. Just stop and think. A stone city weighing millions of tons, marble palaces, cathedrals, squares, columns. All of this stands in the middle of a shifting, rotten swamp. On water. Official science explains to us with a smile, all of this is supported by wooden piles. On wood. We are told that millions of larch trunks were driven into the dirty, salty mire, and a civilization was built on this raft. Do you seriously believe this? Let's set aside emotions and engage cold logic and mathematics. Historians claim that the piles have not rotted for 1,000 years because they are in an anaerobic environment and have supposedly petrified. Remember that word, petrified. Sounds convenient, doesn't it? But any engineer, any biologist, anyone who has ever built a fence at their dacha will tell you that wood in water is organic matter. And organic matter decomposes. Salt water, bacteria, microorganisms, they don't know about historians' decrees. But even if we momentarily accept this absurd myth of eternal larch, a question arises before us that shatters all official chronology to dust. Where did they get so much timber? Let's take just one building, the Basilica di Santa Maria della Salute. Official sources, without hesitation, write, "For the foundation of this church, 1,156,657 wooden piles were driven." Ponder this figure. 1,100,000 trunks. This is not just a number, it's an entire forest. To obtain such a quantity of commercial timber, enormous forest areas would have to be cut down. If we assume that approximately 300 to 400 mature trees suitable for construction grow on 1 hectare, then for this one church alone, a forest area of almost 3,000 hectares would have had to be destroyed. Now, multiply this by all of Venice, by hundreds of palaces, thousands of houses, embankments, bridges. Where did this forest grow? We are told it was transported from the Alps, from Slovenia, from Croatia. Imagine the logistics of the Middle Ages. No railways, no trucks, no cranes. How would you transport millions of tons of timber along mountain roads to the sea? By carts? One horse can pull a certain weight. How many horses would be needed? Thousands? Tens of thousands? What would they eat? Who organized this supply? This is not just a construction project. It's a logistical operation on the level of a modern global corporation. But we are told that it was done by semi-literate people in bast shoes fleeing from barbarians. Let's go further. The pile driving technology. Have you ever seen how piles are driven today? Giant diesel hammers do this. And how was it done back then? Manually? With a pile driver? Let's assume so. Let's calculate. To drive one pile into viscous soil to the required depth manually, a team of strong men needs at least an hour, or even more, considering soil resistance and alignment. There are 24 hours in a day. Even if working around the clock, without sleep or food, one team would drive 24 piles. For 1 million piles, one team would need more than 114 years of continuous work. 114 years just for the foundation of one church. Were there thousands of teams working there? Where did they live? On rafts? Where did they go to the toilet? Where did they get food? Venice is a city that mathematically could not have been built by the methods and within the timelines we are given. They try to convince us that refugees from the Roman Empire, fleeing from the Huns, ran into a swamp and, having nothing better to do, built a marble metropolis there that has stood for 1,000 years. This is a lie. This is a blatant lie, covering up something far more terrible. Why does no one ask the question, why build in a swamp at all? Why create such unbearable difficulties for oneself when there is solid ground nearby? Construction on water costs tens, hundreds of times more. This is economic suicide. No reasonable ruler would spend resources on creating an artificial island unless they had technologies that allowed them to do it quickly and cheaply. What if the piles were always there? Or what if these piles are not just wood? Recently conducted independent analyses show a strange structure of the materials that make up the foundations of some buildings. It's not quite wood and not quite stone. It resembles geopolymer concrete, which the ancients knew how to make, and the secret of which was lost or intentionally hidden. But official history clings to the larch version like a life raft, because if it's admitted that Venice's foundation is high-tech artificial stone, or the result of a completely different civilization's work, the entire house of cards of chronology will collapse. Look at old engravings and maps. Venice appears already complete in them. There are no images of giant construction sites where thousands of people are driving piles. The city simply stands, as if it surfaced or the water came to it. And this is where we get to the most interesting part, to a theory that is feared to be discussed in university departments. What if Venice was not built on water? What if Venice is an antediluvian city that stood on dry land, but as a result of a global catastrophe, that very flood or mudslide, the water level rose and the ground floors went underwater? This explains everything, both the absence of forests that no one cut down, and the absence of millions of slaves with hammers, and the strange doors that lead directly into the water. Have you noticed these doors? Luxurious entrances, half submerged, which can only be approached by boat. We are told it was designed that way. Seriously? A main entrance where dirty water splashes and rats swim in? Architects of the past were aesthetes. They built with consideration for the golden ratio. They understood beauty. Building a main door into the water is nonsense. This is a sign that the water level changed, that the city sank. We look at Venice and see romance, but we should see tragedy. We see the consequences of a planetary-scale catastrophe that was hidden from us by inventing a fairy tale about hard-working Italians and magical large. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. If you dig deeper into the engineering reports of the 19th and 20th centuries, when restorations were carried out, facts emerge that simply do not make sense. It turns out that under many buildings, there are no piles at all in the way we are told. There are slabs there, huge monolithic slabs, the origin of which cannot be determined. Who cast them? How were they delivered? Or was this city 3D printed by gods, and we are now walking through its ruins and inventing absurd explanations? Look closely at the lower floors of Venetian palaces. Just open any photograph where the water's edge is visible and zoom in on the image. What do you see? You see windows that are half, or even completely, submerged under murky green water. You see doorways whose thresholds are licked by waves. They try to convince us that this was such a brilliant idea of past architects. Allegedly, the Venetians, these great masters, specifically built the ground floors so that they would be constantly flooded. We are told that these are water gates for boats, main entrances for guests. But allow me, any builder, even the most inexperienced, knows that water is the main enemy of stone and brick. Capillary moisture wicking destroys masonry in a matter of decades. Were ancient architects really so foolish that they designed palaces worth a fortune with a planned mechanism of self-destruction? Or is there something else hidden here? Something that is being concealed from us? The answer literally lies on the surface. These buildings were not built on water. They were built on dry land. What we today call canals are former streets, ordinary paved roads on which people walked, carriages drove, and horses galloped. The Grand Canal is not a natural waterway. It is a wide central avenue of an ancient metropolis that turned out to be flooded. If this version is accepted, then all architectural absurdities instantly disappear. The windows of the ground floors become normal windows, through which sunlight entered the rooms, and not foul sludge. Doors become normal entrances from the street. Venice is a classic, textbook example of a city that experienced a catastrophic rise in water level, or a sudden subsidence of part of the continent. But official history refuses to acknowledge this, because then the chronology would have to be rewritten, and the fact of a recent global cataclysm acknowledged. Let's talk about materials and logistics, which would make any engineer's brain boil. Venice is built not only of brick, but also of Istrian stone. This is a dense, incredibly heavy limestone that practically does not absorb water. It was transported from Istria, from the other side of the Adriatic. The distance by sea is hundreds of kilometers. Again, let's turn on the calculator. To build gigantic embankments and face hundreds of palaces, millions of tons of stone were required. Millions. Ponder the weight of a single block. This is not a brick that can be tossed in one's hand. These are multi-ton blocks. How were they loaded onto wooden medieval sailing ships? Did they have port cranes? Hydraulics? Or again, mythical thousands of slaves and ropes? Loading a multi-ton block onto a shaky vessel is an engineering task of the highest complexity even today. A shift in the center of gravity by 10 centimeters and the ship will capsize. And they transported this by millions of tons, without losses, in stormy conditions. This sounds like a fairy tale. But the most terrifying thing is not even the stone. The most terrifying thing is the sewage system. Have you ever wondered where the waste products went in a city standing on water in the Middle Ages? The official version states that everything was simply drained into the canals, and the tides washed the filth into the sea. That is to say, Venetians literally lived on a cesspit. Vapors, bacteria, plague, cholera. In such conditions, life expectancy should have been minimal, and epidemics would never cease for a day. But Venice prospered. It was a center of fashion, arts, and luxury. The nobility walked in velvet, breathed the sea breeze, and did not pinch their noses from the stench of rotting sewage under their windows. This is impossible if the sewage system worked as historians tell us. There are diagrams of ancient tunnels and collectors under Venice, about which guidebooks are silent. This is a complex engineering hydrotechnical system that could only function if the city initially stood on solid ground. When the water rose, the system was disrupted, and the city had to urgently adapt to new conditions for survival. Those very piles that we are told are the foundation, perhaps, were only an attempt to reinforce already existing buildings that began to subside in the waterlogged soil. This was not a grand construction from scratch, but a large-scale rescue operation, an attempt to preserve the remnants of a civilization that was sinking underwater before the eyes of astonished descendants. And here is another fact that shatters the official worldview. Drinking water. Venice has no natural sources of fresh water. Around it is a salty lagoon. Where did 200,000 inhabitants get their water? We are shown beautiful stone wells in the squares and told, these are cisterns for collecting rainwater. Allegedly, under each square, a huge reservoir filled with sand for filtration is dug. It sounds ingenious, but have you ever tried to supply a metropolis with rainwater? The consumption volumes are enormous. Drinking, cooking, washing, industrial needs of glassblowers and dyers. There is a lot of rain in Italy, but droughts occur regularly. To make the existence of a trading empire dependent on the whims of the weather is strategic suicide. No reasonable ruler would take such a risk when building a capital. Venetian wells are not just rain collectors. They are outlets of an incredibly complex, possibly artesian system, the technologies of which were lost or blocked by a catastrophe. Or they are remnants of the infrastructure from a time when the city was part of the mainland and had access to aqueducts. We see only the tip of the iceberg, decorated stone wellheads, and invent primitive explanations for their functions. Scientists love to attribute everything incomprehensible to rainwater collection or cult structures when they cannot explain the real technical purpose. Let's return to the soil. The geology of the lagoon is a layered cake of silt, clay, and sand. The hard layer, the so-called caranto, lies at varying depths. For a building to stand for centuries, the piles must rest on this hard layer. If the piles do not reach it, they hold by friction. These are friction piles. For heavy stone palaces, friction piles in soft silt are a guarantee of destruction. Buildings should have wandered, cracked, and tilted every year. Look at modern buildings on poor soils. They crack at the seams without a concrete slab. But Venice stands. Most vertical lines are perfect. How is this possible without geodesy, without precise calculation of loads, without reinforced concrete? We are told about petrified larch. But wood does not turn into stone at the snap of a finger. If it actually petrified, it would become brittle and crack from the slightest vibration. And wood only works as long as it is elastic. Here is a logical dead end. Either the piles there are not wooden, or the foundation is constructed completely differently from what they lie to us about in textbooks. Let's move away from the water and look at the walls. What is Venice built of? It is built of brick, of billions of fired clay bricks. And here begins a real production drama that historians prefer to ignore. To produce one high-quality brick that will last centuries in an aggressive marine environment, you need clay, sand, water, and, most importantly, fire. You need kilns. Giant industrial kilns maintaining temperatures close to 1,000 degrees for a long time. Now ask yourself a simple question. Where were these brick factories located? In a wooden city, standing on piles in the middle of the sea? Lighting a giant fire in such conditions is madness. Any spark in the wind, and Venice would have burned to the ground even at the foundation stage. So, the bricks were transported. From where? From the mainland. Again, let's consider the logistics. One standard brick weighs about 4 kilograms. The construction of one modest 3-story palazzo requires approximately 500,000 bricks. That's 2,000 tons of cargo. For just one house. There are thousands of buildings in Venice. We are talking about tens, hundreds of millions of tons of fired clay. Imagine the flotilla that would have had to transport this. This is not a merchant fleet. It is a continuous conveyor of cargo barges that would have had to operate for centuries without stopping for a minute. Where are the remains of these barges? Where are the port cranes for unloading? Where are the documents for the purchase of such a colossal volume of fuel for the kilns? To fire such a quantity of clay, all the forests of Europe would have had to be burned twice over. But we are told that all of this happened by itself, quietly and unnoticed, by the hands of artisans. But there is a place in Venice that blows any modern engineer's mind even more than bricks. That is the arsenal, the Venetian arsenal. Officially, it is the first factory in the world. We are told that during its heyday, 16,000 people worked there, and they assembled one complete galley in one day. Think about it. One day, one warship. Even Henry Ford, with his assembly line in the 20th century, would have envied such productivity. To assemble a complex engineering structure made of wood, equip it with sails, cannons, and rigging in 24 hours? Manually. Without electricity, without pneumatic tools, without CNC machines. This is technically impossible. Either technologies unknown to us were used in the arsenal, or these ships were not built, but acquired ready-made from somewhere. There is evidence that the arsenal had mechanisms that did not operate on muscle power. What if the Venetian arsenal was not a shipyard, but a repair base for equipment left over from a previous, more advanced civilization? Equipment that the new masters of life simply patched up and used for their needs until the resource ran out. This explains their dominance at sea. They were not brilliant seafarers. They simply found a garage of the gods and managed to start a couple of machines. And here we come to the demographic paradox, which cannot be explained within the framework of the school curriculum. The history of Venice, and Europe as a whole, is full of mentions of terrible plague epidemics. The Black Death wiped out half the population of cities. We are told that the streets were piled with corpses. There was no one to bury the dead. And then, literally a couple of decades after another plague, we see an explosive growth in construction. Who built? Who gave birth to new workers? A woman can give birth to one child per year. To raise him into a stonemason or shipbuilder takes another 15 to 20 years. Human resources recover extremely slowly. The population mathematics does not align with the volumes of work performed. After a catastrophic population decline, there should have been a period of decay, ruin, and desolation for centuries. And instead, we see the Renaissance, a rebirth, a surge in arts and architecture. This is unnatural. It's like after a nuclear war, the surviving mutants would suddenly start building glass and concrete skyscrapers. Where did the people come from? Or were they not quite people? There is a frightening theory that the population was artificially restored. Recall the strange paintings of that time, depicting many infants literally being grown in capsules or vessels, or found in cabbage. Surely this isn't just a metaphor. What if, after a global catastrophe that destroyed the previous civilization, new masters used cloning or incubation technologies to quickly fill empty cities with a workforce? This explains why history seems so short and fragmented to us.
We as a species were reset quite recently. We are the descendants of those who were bred in test tubes to service the surviving infrastructure. We look at Venetian masks and think it's a carnival. But what if the mask is a symbol of depersonalization? A symbol that beneath it, there is no history, no memory, no personality. The Venetian nobility, the so-called black aristocracy, always kept to themselves. They possessed knowledge inaccessible to the common folk. They knew the secrets of navigation, banking, glass, and mirror production. Speaking of glass, Murano glass. These aren't just vases. These are optical technologies. Lenses, mirrors, transparent materials of the highest purity.
At a time when the rest of the world supposedly drank from clay mugs, Venice was making perfect lenses. For what purpose? Only for spectacles? Or for telescopes, geodesic instruments, and perhaps laser weapons? The secrets of the glassblowers were guarded under penalty of death. Why? Because it wasn't a commercial secret, but a secret of the origin of technologies. These were fragments of ancient knowledge that had to be preserved at all costs. Venice resembles a giant warehouse of surviving artifacts, a museum city that barbarians seized and appropriated its grandeur. Look at the sculptures. Marble veils, the finest mesh carved from stone, muscles, veins. Modern machines can barely replicate such work. Yet we are told that a master did this with a chisel and hammer. Have you tried hitting marble with a hammer? One wrong move and everything shatters. To create a veil from stone by hand is impossible. It's either casting, or 3D milling, or the softening of stone by unknown radiation. But to admit this means admitting that we have degenerated, not evolved. Official history is a smokescreen. It is designed to conceal the fact that we live on the ruins of a world that was thousands of times more complex and advanced than ours. We are like children who found the control panel of a nuclear power plant and use it to crack nuts. Venice is that control panel, and it is slowly sinking, taking the truth with it. Or is it being sunk intentionally? After all, as long as these walls stand, we have proof of the lie. Once they go underwater, the evidence will literally be lost at sea, and no one will be able to prove that the piles don't rot, not because they are larch, but because they are not wood at all. Remember how the Campanile collapsed in 1902? It didn't lean, it didn't slide, it folded inward, neatly, vertically, as if by controlled demolition, turning into a mountain of brick dust. Strange for a building that supposedly just deteriorated, isn't it? What if it was deliberately demolished? What if devices were found inside whose operating principle could not be explained or was intended to be hidden? After that, it was quickly rebuilt, as it was, but perhaps without its internal workings. We see only an empty shell, a cargo cult. We imitate the form, but have lost the essence. We ring bells where energy capable of levitating stones once hummed. And this principle of imitation is visible in everything. Look at the sculpture of the winged lion in the square. It is the symbol of Venice. Officially, it is a medieval bronze casting, but when the statue was sent for restoration and spectral analysis was performed, scientists were baffled. The alloy composition turned out to be incredibly complex, with impurities that are difficult to obtain even in modern vacuum furnaces. Moreover, the style of the lion does not align at all with European art of that time. It is a chimera. It is a biomechanical beast, more resembling machines of ancient Assyria or China than the creation of an Italian master. There is a version that it is not a statue, but a petrified or metallized mechanism. An ancient robot, a guardian, found in the ruins and placed on a column as a trophy, given the name of a saint. Does it not disturb you that all of Venice is dotted with symbolism that we call mythical? Dragons, griffins, strange hybrids of humans and animals. We consider this the fantasy of artists. But what if it's documentation? What if, before the catastrophe, before the world was covered by a wave of mud and water, genetic engineering was commonplace? What if these creatures actually lived among people, or were created by them as servants? Then Venice transforms from a romantic city into a laboratory of mad geneticists, the consequences of whose experiments were washed away by a flood. And here the most terrifying hypothesis enters the stage. Why is Venice sinking? We are told global warming, water extraction from artesian wells. Nonsense. The city is sinking because the mechanism that kept it afloat, be it anti-gravity, a vibrational cushion, or some other forgotten technology, has stopped working. The battery died, the energy is gone, and the heavy stone mass began to obey the laws of crude physics, sinking into the silt. Those very piles that historians keep thrusting in our faces, these perhaps were simply grounding electrodes or stabilization rods, not load-bearing structures. Who said that Venice is what we see above the water? Remember how modern skyscrapers are built. The underground part often rivals the above-ground part in size. If Venice is the tip of an antediluvian megalopolis, then beneath the water are hidden floors, streets, tunnels. There, in the darkness and silt, lie the answers to all questions. There stand the real foundations that do not rot, because they are not made of wood. There may be preserved libraries, halls with technology, repositories of genetic material. That is why we are forbidden to dive in the canals. Not because of the dirt, and not because of boat traffic, but because any diver with a good flashlight could see something that would shatter official history in a second. They would see that the walls go down not 2 meters, but 20, 50, 100. That windows continue into the abyss. That the city does not stand on the bottom. It grows from the bottom, like a coral reef created by intelligent design. This thought sends shivers down one's spine. We live in a world of total lies. We have been convinced that we are the pinnacle of evolution, that we fly into space and created the iPhone. But we cannot even replicate the masonry that was supposedly done in Venice in the 13th century. We cannot create a brick that will lie in salt water for 500 years and not crumble into sand. We have degenerated. We are savages who settled in an abandoned palace and burned parquet to keep warm. We look at Venice and think of Casanova's masquerades. But we should be thinking about who lived here before us. Who were these giants of thought, capable of turning a swamp into paradise? And where did they go? They were erased, destroyed, and their homes were populated by us, small, obedient people with short memories. We were given a false chronology, invented fairy tales about larch piles, about refugees from the Huns, about great spice trade, all so that we wouldn't ask the main question: whose city is this, really? And if they could build such a thing, then who destroyed their civilization? This enemy, this force that orchestrated a global reset, it hasn't gone anywhere. It's here. It observes us through tourists' cameras. It ensures that we do not dig too deep. It ensures that restorers cement over seams made with unknown technologies and replace eternal stone with cheap modern replacements. The replacement occurs every day. The original Venice disappears, dissolves, is replaced by papier-mâché. Soon, only a postcard will remain of it, and then it will no longer be possible to prove the truth.